Well, hello everyone. Thank you firstly for inviting me to give this talk this evening. It's a pleasure to be here. And I'm going to be talking to you about a metal detecting discovery from Swettenham and discovery of a late Bronze Age sword. And I'm going to firstly talk a little bit around the object and what the object can tell us, and then set it in its wider context of not only late Bronze Age Cheshire, but also Atlantic Europe. Firstly, I have to acknowledge the work of my collaborators, Vanessa Oakden, Ben Jones, and Dirk Brandherm, who all contributed to this research and the paper that was in the latest issue of JCAS. Here's the sword in question. It was discovered in October 2018. And it wasn't necessarily a straightforward discovery. One of the fragments was picked up during a metal detecting club rally, Congleton and District Metal Detecting Club, and the finder Rick Firth kind of rallied round other members of the club, and after finding the first fragment, they scoured the field for the rest of the sword, and quite remarkably, they picked up another 4 fragments. So you're left with a mostly complete sword, although they didn't find the tip, and they've been back since, and unfortunately still can't find the tip. So it seems it's destined to remain a little bit incomplete, but finding a sword in this condition from late Bronze Age Britain in a field in Cheshire is a remarkable thing. The sword itself can be dated to around 950 to 880 BC, so we're looking at just less than 3,000 years old. And there's various stylistic properties that allow us to place it within late Bronze Age manufacturing traditions, specifically that of carp's tongue swords. Carp's tongue swords fit within a broader tradition happening in Atlantic Europe, and this relates partly to the manufacture of specific types of swords, as well as wider depositional practices where objects were gathered together, broken and deposited in large hoards, particularly in southeastern England and northwestern France. And often they contain a variety of continental style material and also insular British material. The Swettenham sword is a single find. There's no great hoard of material, and stylistic properties of the sword, such as the shape of the hilt, the presence of what's slot within the tang, which would have helped fasten on a handle, as well as some of the decoration on the blade. Here you can see elements of cast ribs on the blade. These all speak to the idea that this falls within the tradition of carp's tongue sword making, but at a fairly specific period, which is why we've been able to narrow the date down to about 950 and 880, because it shares elements of older styles of swords and also new styles of swords, and for this reason it's referred to as a transitional type. And that's about as much as I'll say about Bronze Age typology. It's for a very particular niche of person. Perhaps more interestingly is the evidence of use and damage, as well as manufacture. We can see that the sword has been relatively well prepared, and that's evidenced by the fact that the edges have been show signs of working, and there's no casting flash that you'd expect from when it's been taken straight out of the mold. It's difficult to see signs of use because, as you can see, the blade fragments have corroded. But one thing that particularly interests me is the deliberate damaging of objects, or rather the fragmentation of objects prior to being put in the ground. And one of the critical questions in analysing this sword is, it's in 5 fragments, but is that the result of modern damage? Is that accidental damage in the past, or is it deliberate deformation in the past? A key point is that the field in which it was found, the landowner indicated that it had only been ploughed once during his knowledge during the late 1990s, and for that reason, and part of that is because the field wasn't suitable for ploughing. And so that steers us away from the idea that it might be modern damage. And we can couple this with elements of the breakage patterns. You can see in the section here that you've got these big black pockets, and these are air holes, casting flaws that have occurred during the casting of the sword, and you can see it on its refitting piece over here. And these would have created structural weaknesses that would have encouraged the sword to break through accident. There's also a fairly consistent patternation across these pieces, and that suggests that not only are these breaks ancient, but coupled with the casting flaws, the fragmentation may be a bit accidental, perhaps through working the sword. If you're hammering the edges, you often need to anneal and heat the sword, and that might cause it to fracture. However, we do also have some evidence, which you can see in the bottom left here, and this is a much fresher break, so there clearly has been some modern damage. And then we have the damage to the hilt, and you can see that this is quite heavily bent, and there's damage to one of the shoulders of the hilt. This suggests a couple of things. I would argue that this is probably deliberate damage that's been inflicted in the past, and one of the reasons I would suggest that is because to cause this bending of the hilt, it means that the handle can't have been attached at the point of deposition. It would be very, very difficult to achieve this amount of bending by accident if the handle was on, and that suggests perhaps a more deliberately inflicted damage for whatever reason. And so in sum, what we have is a sword that shows a whole mixture of the possibilities of how it may have become broken. Some bits are more recent damage, and other bits seem to be a bit more accidental in the past. And perhaps that is what then influenced the fact that you then continue to damage the sword. You remove the handle and you bend it. And we see this we see this to varying degrees in various different ways across late Bronze Age Europe, where people are deliberately damaging their objects before they place them in the ground, as much as it seems counterintuitive to our modern mindsets. Set within its broader context, it becomes quite an unusual find. What you see on the map here is all the late Bronze Age metalwork that's been found from Cheshire to date, and we're taking a fairly broad span here of about 1100 BC to 800 BC. So we're looking at a spread of about 300 years in which the Swettenham sword sits in the very middle of this period. It's mostly a scattering of single finds, things like axes and spears, both complete and incomplete. And in that sense, the Swettenham sword fits within that pattern. It's a single find. Hoards are quite rare, and also evidence of Bronze Age metalwork at settlements is also rare. And until relatively fairly recently, if you'd asked, if you tried to map out swords from late Bronze Age swords from Cheshire, you'd have been hard pushed to put many examples on. However, there's been an increase in these numbers, which is influenced by metal detecting activity, and these are often fragments, although there's a couple of older finds that are slightly older finds that are worth drawing your attention to. The first is a sword fragment alongside metal casting, debris and socketed axes at Beeston Castle, and an antiquarian find from Alderley Edge, which reports a complete Bronze Age sword recovered from what was an early Bronze Age copper mine, although that sword no longer survives. So the Swettenham sword sort of fits with the broader picture, but it's also anomalous for the fact that it's mostly complete, albeit in an incomplete form. In terms of parallels for the sword, in terms of the carp's tongue tradition, in the broader area of the West Midlands and North Wales, there's only 4 pieces that fit within this tradition, and there's only 2 swords that fit within that. The first is Swettenham, and then there's another piece that has come up from here at number 7 at Northwich, and this is much more common of what you'd expect from carp's tongue deposition. It's been heavily fragmented, reduced as though it's going to go into a crucible. This would have been a key way of recycling and remelting metal, but enough survives of this sword hilt for us to attribute it to the same manufacturing tradition as the Swettenham sword, although it can't be as precisely dated. We can step back even further from Cheshire and look at how the Swettenham sword sits within Atlantic Europe as a whole. And here, what my colleague Dirk Brandherm has, he's an authority on the carp's tongue swords and carp's tongue traditions, and he's mapped out all the swords from Atlantic Europe that fall within the same manufacturing tradition of that transitional sword type that you find at Swettenham. And you see that there is a scattering of them in southern Britain. This is the first from northwestern England. Those that have been found in Britain tend to be single finds, although you've only got a sample of 5 examples, 1 from a hoard and 4 as single finds. They're more common in northwestern France, where they're actually more common in hoards than as single finds, and another little cluster here in southern Iberia. So you've got a broad sweep of this tradition and a broad network that this sword fits into. And I think that's one of the key takeaways in looking at this object. We know that during the Late Bronze Age, and indeed in other periods, swords are quite powerful objects. It allows you to fight. It can be seen as a symbol of power, of authority, and undoubtedly to own one in the Bronze Age would have been symbolic. And I think that's even more the case when we're looking at areas where swords are not so commonly deposited. And from that, we may assume that they are less commonly in circulation, or at least too valuable in circulation to place in the ground. And that in turn increases the value of the act that happened at Swettenham, where depositing the sword was deemed so valuable that it was worth giving up. It was worth more than the sword itself as an icon. And in thinking about why this might be, we can turn to its wider connections, the fact that it fits within this broad European-wide tradition, and really in Cheshire, it's very much the fringes of that tradition. These wouldn't have been common objects. It's unclear whether this is an import or whether this is someone traveling with knowledge, but I think the overall decision to the fact that it's there and the overall decision to then bury it, I think tells us something of the meaning of the act and the meaning of the object itself. The fact that it connects these local communities with much broader things happening at and around the same time, not just in Cheshire, not just in Britain, but across the whole of Atlantic Europe. And I want to close by acknowledging that this sword is now on display at Congleton Museum. It was very kindly donated by Rick Firth and other members of the Congleton and District Metal Detecting Club, and it's a fantastic example of the collaboration that can happen not just amongst archaeologists but also with detectorists in unraveling some of these object stories that can have far-reaching implications. So thank you very much for listening, and I'd be very happy to answer any questions.